guys, welcome back to Falcon Central Radio on the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I am one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman, joined as usual by my co-host Matt Carrolley. Today we're going to be catching you guys up on the combine, giving you some of our winners and losers at some key positions of need for the Falcons. We'll also sort of catch you guys up on some of the Falcons' recent free agency move. We'll get into sort of the franchise tag for Grady Jarrett, as well as some other rumors and reports surrounding the Falcons. And of course, as usual, we will answer your mailbag questions towards the end of the show. So, Matt, let's jump right in and let's talk about the big news of the past 7 days, which is the Falcons placing the franchise tag on Grady Jarrett. It is the non-exclusive franchise tag. It's going to be worth $15.209 million. That will count towards immediately towards the Falcons salary cap. They have until July 15th to get him signed to a long-term contract, or he will be forced to play the 2019 season under that franchise tag. And then the Falcons will have to go through this all over again with potentially tagging him and or trying to sign him to an extension 11 months from now. So what are your thoughts on the Falcons making this move on Grady Jarrett?
Well, it obviously needed to be done. I mean, you got to have Grady Jarrett in the fold in 2019. I've been saying on Twitter, I think he's the most indispensable defensive player on the team. People can argue Keanu Neal, Deion Jones, but I think football's a game of the trenches. It starts up front, and Grady Jarrett's easily the Falcons' best defensive lineman. So you need to keep him, on the books. And, this obviously gives them a little bit more time to work out a long-term extension. Now, ideally, this isn't the best-case scenario of how things can go with this, just from the standpoint that, it hamstrings them from a salary cap standpoint. This is basically half of what they had, based on my calculations, to spend in free agency to fill out their roster. $15 million. I had them before with $30 million to spend, and so now they're down to $15 million. So hopefully, when it's all said and done, they do get a long-term extension done, and that lowers the cap hit. And Joe Corey, a salary cap expert that writes for CBS, interviewed with Vaughn McClure, and McClure wrote an article about it and said, if they do get a long-term extension done, Grady's 2019 cap hit could be as low as $5 to $6 million. So if that's the case, you're looking at an extra $9 million to play with. Now that's obviously the best case scenario. I think more likely 10 to 12 million is probably more reasonable, but even still, I mean, that's a difference of $3 million. That can get you a mid-level signing that can certainly help out your ball club. So, I'm still optimistic that they'll get something done before that July 15th deadline. Right now, it does seem like they're a little bit farther apart, but again, they do have several months here. We should probably not expect something to come during the free agent period. But again, the most important thing is getting it done and getting it done before that July 15th deadline so that we don't have to worry about this next off season.
Yeah. I think, generally speaking, we'll see if the Falcons can, buck this trend. But generally, once a player gets tagged, nothing happens on that front for months and months until we get to June, late June, early July, when that deadline is sort of looming. So I think if people are sort of expecting the Falcons to get Grady Jarrett signed to an extension, in the next couple of weeks to sort of create some cap space for them to sign free agents, as you mentioned, I think that's probably very unlikely to happen. So, I mean, the interesting thing with this whole Grady Jarrett situation is how, the rumors have sort of been talking about how he wants Aaron Donald money. And I don't necessarily really buy those rumors. I just think they're, people, I don't know. For me, I guess if I'm going to speculate, and I don't, obviously I don't have inside sources or anything like that, I think it's less about him wanting Aaron Donald money, which is so much higher than the next highest paid defensive tackle that it, to me, it's just not realistic at all that he's going to go from, 16, 17 million a year to 22.5 million a year type of contract. So I think the reality is probably more that the Falcons and him are sort of far apart on the guaranteed money. And Aaron Donald got like 87 million guaranteed in his contract. Then the next highest paid guy, Fletcher Cox, got like 63 million in his contract. And then after that, you have like Kawan Short, who got like 45 million. And so basically, you're looking at like 20 million difference between each one of those three guys. And that to me is probably where the reports that they're far apart are sort of stemming from. At least that's much more plausible to me than necessarily Grady Jarrett suddenly after, one not even Pro Bowl season is suddenly wanting to be paid alongside, like the reigning defensive player of the year. That just doesn't make any sense to me. So when you hear that Grady Jarrett shares the same agent as Fletcher Cox, I think that's probably more likely that is sort of where his price range is at. And he's basically probably wanting something north or equal to what Fletcher Cox is making. So that to me seems a lot more plausible than the whole like he wants Aaron Donald money, which is causing people to be like, oh, if he wants Aaron Donald money, then the Falcons shouldn't even try to sign him and they should let him go, which I think is just people being a little bit, dramatic at this point in time.
Yeah, I think that's all extremely fair.
So, now that this deal is done, basically, it limits the Falcons' cap space, but they did find some cap space to get Matt Schaub re-signed to a 2-year contract last week. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on the Falcons doing that deal with Matt Schaub and getting him locked up for another couple of years to be Matt Ryan's backup?
I'm good with it. I'm a little surprised. I wasn't. I thought this might be the year. You cut a guy like Matt Bryant. This could be the year where they're going to move on from some of those aging guys and say, this is the year. It's time to move on. But obviously, they value him. They look at him more than just a backup quarterback. I do think they look at him like an assistant quarterback coach alongside Greg Knapp. Both of those guys have worked together for a while, and they know this offense inside and out. So, I think that is why this contract was struck. Now, one could ask, why didn't they just maybe hire Matt Schaub to be a coach? And I forget where I saw it, but I do think Matt Schaub, if he was going to spend time around the game, it seems like he wants to maybe get into broadcasting first, is what I saw a story. So I think, I don't know if the coaching thing was in the cards necessarily. So if you want him back and you want him back to basically be a pseudo coach, this was the avenue to do that. So, I am curious to see what the contract terms are going to be. Jeff Schultz from The Athletic kind of in his article yesterday said that it's probably, the cap hit's probably half of what it was this past year, which was, I think, like 4.5 million. So we should probably expect 2 to 3 million for him. And again, backup quarterbacks don't necessarily come cheap. At least the better ones do. So for me, I'm fine with it. It does kind of go against the grain, though, of some of the penny pinching moves. So at that point, if you're going to look at it that way, it is a little head scratching. But again, I'm cool with it. If Matt Ryan, God forbid, was ever to go down, you want someone at least that does have experience, and Matt Schaub does have the experience that, again, it's going to be a steep drop off, but at least you're not going in there with uncertainty. At least you know what you're going to get. So I'm fine with it. Again, hopefully it is in that line with a 2 million per year type of thing. But yeah, I'm cool with it.
Yeah, I have similar thoughts on it. I think clearly the Falcons are looking at a veteran quarterback presence to sort of basically, teams tend to side on two sides of the fence when it comes to their backup quarterback position. They want basically a guy that's going to be an extra coach in the film room and on the practice field, or they want a young, talented, sort of developmental guy that they can sort of maybe, turn into a starter down the road or turn into a high-level backup down the road or something, or, develop for a couple of years and then trade for assets or something, like we saw Green Bay do for many, many years with guys like Aaron Brooks and Matt Hasselbeck. But clearly the Falcons are on the side of let's have a extra coach in there. And I think it makes sense, particularly given that Matt Ryan probably is going to play for another 5 to 7 years, hopefully. And so trying to develop a young guy is not necessarily something that's really, maybe in a couple of years they can sort of look to try to develop, the heir apparent to Matt Ryan. But I think for the meantime, having a guy like Schaub who can kind of step in and be at least a solid game manager, and then maybe sort of seeing what you can get out of Kurt Benkert or another undrafted free agent for the next year or so makes a lot more sense. So good on Matt Schaub. I'm sure, they usually say that the backup quarterback is the most popular person in the city, but for some reason, people are not Falcon fans don't tend to be that big on Matt Schaub. I just see a lot of people not too happy about that move.
I see a lot of people saying Matt Schaub should be the starter. He should be the QB1.
Well, I
So,
mean,
he definitely does have his fans on Twitter.
I am one of those.
Yeah.
I am definitely one of the people. Preseason games matter, and Matt Schaub has outperformed Matt Ryan in every preseason that he's been here. So that tells you something.
Yeah.
So we got some news on the coaching front. You thought the Falcons were pretty much done with changing their coaching staff, but their defensive line coach, Bryant Young, has decided to step down and spend time with his family, and the Falcons have hired Jess Simpson to take over that D-line coach position. Simpson was at the University of Miami last year after a year as being the Falcons' defensive assistant/assistant D-line coach in 2017. So the Falcons get some continuity from someone who's been here in Atlanta. Matt, do you have any thoughts on this coaching change?
Yeah, this was kind of surprising to see this morning, but I do think, and I don't think this would have happened unless the reports came out that said that Bryant Young wanted to be, spend more time with his family. Because I know originally the connection with him and Quinn started at Florida in 2011, 2012 as the D-line coach there. And then similar reasons, he kind of took a hiatus. I think, I don't know if it was his son that maybe passed away, but he was definitely dealing with some personal issues. And so he stepped away from the game for 5 years. And I'm thinking, whether something else happened or, again, he's just kind of putting his priorities into focus better, which you can't fault a guy for that. So, again, I don't think this move would have necessarily happened if something like this personally didn't happen to Bryant Young or Bryant Young, had a change of heart. But again, Simpson, like you mentioned, was on the staff before, a guy that Quinn knows and kind of should be a seamless fit. He was the assistant D-line coach, right, in 2017, or just an assistant? Yeah. So I mean,
he was technically like a defensive assistant that worked with the D-line. So
okay, so yeah, basically an assistant D-line coach. So. I don't think a whole lot's going to change. Hopefully, the guys continue to progress under Simpson the way that we hoped, and they showed some signs of under Bryant Young.
There you go. We got some other additional things from ESPN's Vaughn McClure yesterday, and today we'll touch upon sort of his report that Deion Jones is in contract talks in a moment, but. Let's talk about some of the nuggets that Vaughn McClure dropped from sort of his post-combine coverage, where he basically came away with several takeaways, one of which was that the Falcons have strong interest in Oklahoma offensive tackle Cody Ford. They also may target Kevin Pamphile in free agency, formerly of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and Tennessee Titans, sort of reuniting him with Dirk Cutter, who Pamphile started at left guard for 2 seasons in 2016 2017 in Tampa Bay. And he's sort of mentioned that, the Falcons might be a long shot to trade for Cleveland Browns running back Duke Johnson as a potential replacement for Tevin Coleman. And he also saw that, the Falcons could have 2 current players retire, and, left it a mystery sort of who the identity of those players could possibly be. So, Matt, I will cede you the floor and you can sort of attack these 4 nuggets in any way that you want to.
Yeah, I think, at the top, you started with Cody Ford's interest with the Falcons, and I think that's the biggest one. And for me, I'm surprised because, again, we talked about, I think, last week's show, the Sombrilo deal kind of seemed like it might push offensive line to the side, at least in round 1. But if you're interested in a guy like Cody Ford, you're going to have to get him. You're going to have to take him in round 1 if you truly want him. So, I mean, for me, that kind of I have a positive outlook on that because that means offensive line, they're still going to consider it early in the draft. And, that's a couple months ago. That's what I kind of wanted them to do as far as how they should attack this offseason is target offensive line heavy in the draft, and then see if you can dabble in free agency with the D-line. Now that doesn't seem to be the case, given the latest roster moves with keeping Vic Beasley and tagging Grady Jarrett. So honestly, it's going to come down to, I think, best player available at the position of need, whether it's offensive tackle or whether it's D-line. I think that's what they're going to be looking at. And if it's Cody Ford, I mean, I totally would sign off on that pick. I think he's a plug-and-play right tackle. I think he brings you that nasty, mean streak that the coaching staff wants from this team heading into 2019. So, again, that's something to keep a close eye on. As far as some of the other nuggets, Kevin Panfill, I talked a little bit on my Twitter feed last night about him. I didn't realize he's only 28 going on 29. I thought he was in his 30s. A guy that was drafted in 2014, I believe, in round 5 out of Purdue, and a very raw prospect coming out. He only played 1 year of high school football and came to Purdue as a D lineman and eventually transitioned to O-line. So again, he could be a low-risk, high-reward signing where he's finally coming into his own. He was hurt last year, so it's hard to evaluate his past season of football. But again, you mentioned the connection to Dirk Cutter. I think guys like that are going to develop strong connections in free agency. So you're going to see guys that have connections, whether it's to Malarkey or Cutter or any of the other coaches. So, Panfill's a guy to keep a close eye on. I believe Mike Person got a 3-year, $9 million deal in San Francisco, the guard there. So something similar is probably what Panfill is going to ask for, maybe a little bit less because he was hurt all of last season. So that's something as far as what he would cost. The Duke Johnson thing, I don't really think there's much there. I think it's just Vaughn trying to connect some really, really far dots using Devontae Freeman's connection, both Miami guys, Miami natives, to try to pair them together. I mean, it all sounds well and good, but Falcons aren't in a position to trade for a contract like that, or is running back really that high on the needs list? And then lastly, as far as the two mystery names that could potentially be retiring, I think Ryan Schrader's one of them, just from the simple standpoint that it would make sense because, we speculated all season about him not looking right and him not looking himself. And maybe that really was the case and he's realizing that. And it's like, it's better to go out on my terms rather than, keep playing and tarnishing your legacy or whatnot. So I would say he could potentially be one of them. And then maybe that's why they haven't made the move already to say we're going to cut him. And then the other one is a little tougher. I think it's probably Logan Paulson. Now, I don't know if, when he's throwing something like this out, is it guys only under contract? Because technically Paulson's a free agent. So would Vaughn, categorize him as a Falcon retiring? Probably still. So if I had to take a shot in the dark on who the second one is, I'd probably lean Paulson. But, your guess is as good as mine, I think, on this one.
Well, I sort of assumed that one of them was Andy Levitre.
No, that's also a good candidate, yeah.
I didn't think necessarily Ryan Schrader was a candidate because when he was talking about sort of Panfield, he mentioned that Schrader's status was in limbo, and it would seem that if he sort of expected him to retire, he probably would have been more specific about sort of what type of limbo he is. And my assumption with Ryan Schrader. Yeah.
I forgot about that point.
He'll be a post June 1 cut in the next week or so, but we'll see how that goes. The Duke Johnson thing was probably the most interesting nugget of just because it seemed the most implausible of the things, as you mentioned. To me, what's interesting about it is not necessarily that the Falcons would trade for Duke Johnson, although I will say that his base salary this year is only like $1.8 million. So it wouldn't really take a lot of cap space for the Falcons to pull off that trade, but I just think it's very unlikely that the Browns are going to trade Duke Johnson anytime soon just because they picked up Kareem Hunt last month, and he's going to be suspended, and he's going to be various rumors suggest that he'll get miss most of, or at least half of this upcoming season. And so, for however long he's going to be suspended, you're going to need Duke Johnson sort of to platoon with Nick Chubb. So I think if they're going to trade Duke Johnson, it's going to, come in October or something once they have sort of figured out what, Nick Chubb is and what Kareem Hunt is going to bring to the table as opposed to this offseason. But what was interesting about it is that if the Falcons, if it's, legit, it does suggest that the Falcons sort of see replacing Tevin Coleman as a move. I wouldn't necessarily call it a priority, but is something that the Falcons are very interested in doing, maybe because they're not as confident in Devontae Freeman returning 100% and bouncing back to his pre-injury form, or maybe they're not as confident in Ito Smith or Brian Hill sort of filling Tevin Coleman's shoes. So that would be something to keep an eye on as far as maybe the Falcons' need at running back being given a little bit more stock than I think either you or I sort of see it at this point in time in the offseason. With Panfield, it'd be an interesting move. I think I see him more as just purely a depth sort of, because he has versatility. He's played 4 of the 5 offensive line positions, all but center, and be a guy that can sort of push for a starting job. But if the Falcons signed him with the intention of starting him, I would question that move quite a bit. But, one of the things I plan on doing later this week is go back and watch some of him when he was in Tampa Bay, because I just don't have a strong memory of what he was. But my recollection is that he wasn't particularly good when he was starting for the Bucs at left guard. And with Cody Ford, I think it goes back to sort of my thoughts on the Falcons' first-round pick. They're not just going to basically draft a position. They're going to draft a player. And so that does mean that offensive linemen are still in the mix there. They're going to, whether it's an interior guy or an offensive tackle like Cody Ford or an edge rusher or D tackle, it's not really going to be the Falcons are going to go into that 14th overall pick and be like, well, this is our biggest need position and we're going to draft this player no matter what. It's going to be, we're going to draft who we think the best player is, probably at one of those positions of need. But, we'll sort of see how that goes. And so it's, I, like you, and was very concerned in the sort of post-Ty Sambrailo contract world whether the Falcons would punt on the offensive tackle position early in this draft and maybe wait until round 3 or 4 and take a developmental guy. But, hearing this news at least leaves the door open that I can be at least semi-optimistic that maybe the Falcons will still be willing to take a quality offensive tackle at pick 14, which I think Cody Ford is. So the other nugget that Vaughn dropped today was that the Falcons were beginning contract talks with middle linebacker Deion Jones. Matt, what are your thoughts on this?
If you're not going to get Grady Jarrett done this year, and, I hope they're still going to try to make progress on the Julio Jones matter. Deion Jones is next in line, so this makes a lot of sense to get in front of the ball on this, and I think maybe even learn some lessons from not getting Grady Jarrett done, an off season ahead of time, because again, we saw how Grady Jarrett's market just skyrocketed over this past season that he had, and something similar could happen with Deion Jones if they don't get it done, sooner rather than later. So, I know that Houston Texans did something similar last off season with their second round middle linebacker Benardrick McKinney. They signed him during the summer for a 5-year, I believe, like $52 million deal, prior to his 4th year in the league. So Falcons might be playing copycat. It is a copycat league after all. So, again, if people are asking, I know we have a question about where's this money coming from to potentially sign Deion Jones, since, we're talking like they don't have a lot to spend. Well, if they sign Deion Jones to a long-term deal, really all that they have to worry about covering in the current year is his signing bonus. So say he gets like a $20 million signing bonus, and that's prorated over 5 years. So $4 million of that would hit this year only. And they can, obviously do that. They can even lower his base salary and push some of that cost, or lower this year's base salary and push some of that cost down the road. So when you sign a guy to a long-term deal, as the case usually is, you have more flexibility of kind of getting that first year, in at a reasonable clip. So that's kind of how that would work. But again, this makes all the sense in the world. Deion Jones is the next man up. on the contract list. So I'm glad they're kind of getting ahead of the ball here rather than wait like they did with Grady.
Sorry, muted my microphone. I do that all the time. We got a question from Mave2124. He asks, I am getting confused. Where is the money to sign a long-term deal with Deion Jones coming from? Figured Grady and Julio would be first. Yes. Yeah, that is the case. Grady and Julio should come first. I think the earliest timetable for when the Deion Jones deal will get done is, say, July or August, after presumably the Falcons will get Grady done by July 15th, and Julio probably sometime this summer before training camp kicks off as well. I think what Matt mentioned, sort of getting ahead of the Deion Jones contract situation, sort of to learn the lesson that, maybe you can argue they did not necessarily take full advantage of to get the Grady Jarrett deal done on a timely fashion, because next offseason, at this current time, you have guys like Vic Beasley, you have Austin Hooper, you have Deion Jones, all becoming free agents next year. Of course, the incomparable Matt Bosher. And, if you go into the March with none of those contracts done, it's going to create similar headaches as we're seeing right now, with potentially Jones being tagged and that costing the team, 15, 16 million or whatever the case may be, and just basically taking away any of their cap space. So I think with, Deion Jones, they're going to probably start talking now. That doesn't mean that a deal is imminent. Deion Jones is only counting about $1 million against the cap. They don't have a ton of cap space currently. So your intuition, maybe 2124, is correct to sort of get Deion Jones done to a long-term deal right now. So this is just, let's sort of get on some page. Let's have a little bit of conversation about this. And then, come July, August, maybe we can pick up things in earnest to get maybe something done on the books before the season starts, after we get some of these other deals done, so that we can get ahead of this. And so we don't necessarily have to tag Deion Jones next offseason, as I said, and then lose whatever cap space the Falcons have at that point, and then have a repeat of this offseason where everybody is sort of throwing their hands up and wondering why the Falcons aren't going to spend a lot of money. So let's get into the combine review. Let's get through some of these winners and losers, and we'll sort of focus on some of the main areas of need for the Falcons at the tight end position, on the offensive line, the D-line, the edge rushers, and the cornerback position. Matt, I'll let you start us off with some of your winners and losers at the tight end position.
Yeah, so this was a guy that people know I'm a big fan of. I thought Foster Moreau did exactly what I was hoping he would do, as far as test really, really well. I don't have the particular Spark numbers. I don't know if you had them up in front of you, but basically he killed it as far as I think maybe Noah Fant was one of the only ones that maybe did better than him from an athletic standpoint. So he really made himself a lot of money. Unfortunately, probably now the secret's out about him, and teams and scouts alike are going to start diving into his tape and seeing exactly what he brings to the table. So, I was hoping he could maybe slip to day 3, in that round 4 range. I don't know if that's necessarily still going to be the case. Again, I've likened him to the George Kittle of this class. So I'm hoping that's the case and he continues to slide. But I think there's definitely something there. I think he's the second best blocker in this class. And so he definitely helped himself out at the combine there. As far as losers at the tight end position, and, Falcons fans know this name very well, being a Georgia Bulldog, but it's hard not to say Isaac Nada. He ran in the 4.9s, and typically that's a death knell for a lot of tight ends. Now, again, I don't know if there's a huge surprise, though, about him not testing well. Now, maybe not that poorly, but, when you watch him, you don't necessarily see athleticism pop off the tape. So, again, to completely make him undraftable, I wouldn't agree with, but I definitely think as far as, the round 3 grade that maybe he had coming into the combine, I think you definitely have to push him towards day 3 at this point, maybe round 5. And again, Falcons have one of the nuggets that Vaughn talked about that I don't think we touched on was he mentioned with the comp picks, the Falcons are going to want to look at a blocking tight end and also a punt or kick returner. And so Isaac Nada, I think, could fill that role as that second tight end. I think he does bring it as a blocker, and then also does have some obviously upside as a receiver. So again, maybe the Falcons benefit from something like this, but Isaac Nada was definitely my loser from the tight end class.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because Nada is a guy that I figured the Falcons would sort of target in the draft because of their need for a potential blocker, and I think he's one of the better ones, at least I've seen. And again, I haven't necessarily evaluated this entire tight end class, but he may be a loser because you're right. He tested poorly. I don't think anybody expected him to blow up the combine, but probably not to test as poorly as he did. But it might actually help him, if you're a Georgia fan and you wanted the Falcons to draft Isaac Nada, because now I think it does mean that, instead of being a third or possibly early fourth round pick at the latest, which it seemed like was where his draft stock was, now he could slide into the latter part of round 4 with one of those comp picks for the Falcons, or even into round 5, where the Falcons are sort of picking as well. So, he may be a loser overall in terms of a hit to his draft stock, but if you're a Falcon fan that wanted him to be a Falcon, then I think it actually works out in his favor a little bit if you're going to just be sort of selfish and want the Falcons to take him. So that being said, let's move on and talk about the offensive line. I'll handle this, and I'll give a winner and loser at both the interior and the at the offensive tackle position. My winner on the interior, I felt Chris Lindstrom, I thought, tested really well, surprisingly well, but I thought Garrett Bradbury was the true winner because I think he's probably going to come out of the combine as sort of the consensus top interior offensive lineman when you group centers and guards together. And I do think there's now a possibility. I think the Rams were probably chilling at the end of round 1 thinking, oh, yeah, we'll be able to snatch Garrett Bradbury and he'll be our John Sullivan replacement. And now I think that's going to be a little bit harder for them. So, he might even inch up into the top 20 conversation in my eyes. A winner at the offensive tackle position is Andre Dillard, who tested extremely well. I thought Dillard was a guy that going into the combine, I thought people would be buzzing about and potentially solidify himself as a top 10, if not even possibly a top 5 offensive lineman in draft pick. And I think based off of how he tested, I think that's going to be the case, particularly with other guys like Greg Little and Jonah Williams, who are sort of in the conversation to be the top left tackle in this draft class, not coming out of this combine looking particularly favorably. And so I think Dillard is going to solidify himself as LT1 on most teams' boards this April. And I think that's going to lead to him getting drafted pretty highly because I think a number of teams in the top 10 or 12 picks definitely have major needs on the offensive line. And because the free agent class along the offensive line is pretty much awful. It's basically, if you're looking for a left tackle, it's Trent Brown, and that's about it. So whoever doesn't get Trent Brown in free agency, I think is going to be very interested in a guy like Andre Dillard at the top of this draft. My losers on the offensive line, on the interior, I had Drew Samia, the guard from Oklahoma. He was considered, it was hard to find a loser on the interior, but he was, I thought, would test really well and be one of the more athletic guards in this draft class from what I had seen of him, and he did not test particularly well. So I think that's going to hurt his stock a little bit in sort of coming off the heels of the Senior Bowl, where I think a lot of people saw him as the higher upside between him and his teammate, Ben Powers. I think Powers came out of the Senior Bowl looking a little bit better in the practices. And then, with Samia sort of coming out of this combine, not testing as favorably, I think he'll still probably be taken somewhere in round 4 or so range. But I think he did not necessarily help himself to become a day 2 sort of selection. So I think he'll probably be a day 3 guy. And offensive tackle is the guy I mentioned, Greg Little, who, at the beginning of this process, I think a lot of people were saying, he was going to be considered one of the top left tackles in this draft class because people had question marks about Jonah Williams and whether he's a true left tackle. And Little is a talented, athletic guy. but pretty raw. But then when he comes to the combine, he doesn't really test particularly well. Doesn't show that athleticism that you at least would have been like, hey, he's still got some development to do, but at least he's got sort of the skills with the athleticism and the movement and all these sorts of things. And coming out of the combine, not testing particularly well, I think there's a chance that Greg Little is going to fall all the way to the second round in this draft. So, he'll probably still get drafted somewhere in the top 50 just because of the positional need. But I think now there's opportunities for other offensive tackles to sort of leapfrog him and create some separation. So he's going to be considered, I think, more of a consolation prize for some teams drafting somewhere in the top 50 rather than maybe the go-to guy at that offensive tackle position. Matt.
Yeah, and just to touch on the Bradbury and Lindstrom comments, because I know and I include myself in this group at least the last several weeks. As far as fans hoping that one of those two guys might slip to that pick 45. Well, like you said, after this combine, I don't know if there's any shot that happens. So as far as, if the plan was originally to get a defensive lineman in round 1, and then, hopefully you can pick from, this interior line class that was, originally supposed to be the sweet spot was that early to mid second round. I think now, you have to start switching up your plan a little bit, because I don't think either of those guys are going to be available. I think maybe Eric McCoy would be available, and I think he's someone that also helped himself at the combine. So again, you kind of have to, like you said at the top of the show, as far as you draft based on the player, but also a player that fits your need. So again, maybe offensive line early in round 1, and then you go to defensive line, and that kind of will segue me into the winners and losers of the D-line and edge class. I think guys like Kalen Saunders and Tristan Hill, who Tristan Hill kind of really wasn't on my radar. I did see John Ledyard of the Draft Network kind of study him in the last week or so from UCF, Tristan Hill. And he was a guy that definitely helped himself, made some money at the combine, testing extremely well. So again, if the Falcons aren't going to go D-line early, guys like Tristan Hill, Kalen Saunders, I think Kalen Saunders might have solidified himself as a day 2 pick, kind of in that same range that Deidrin Senat was last year, top 100, but maybe not necessarily top 75. A guy from small school, Western Illinois, that, again, for a big man, he can sure move. So pairing him with Senat and Jarrett, maybe that's kind of, could be in the Falcons' future. I thought as far as interior D-line losers, Draymond Jones kind of disappointed me. I thought he came in kind of, overweight, or at least didn't put on good weight. Was slow in most of the running drills and most of the positional drills. So for a guy that I had pegged originally as a round 2 guy that, again, kind of, his calling cards, his speed and his quickness as a, interior pass rusher, not necessarily a stout run defender type of interior defensive lineman. He didn't show that at all over the weekend. So I thought he hurt himself, and maybe he's a guy that falls even out of round 2. As far as the edge players go, the obvious name is Montez Sweat. Certainly he lit up the combine, but I'm going to go with a little bit more unheralded guy. I thought Chase Winovich was really impressive. I didn't really see those times coming from him. You could say he had some of the best overall edge times of any of the other players in that class. So, he was a guy that originally coming in, I thought, maybe round 2 is a little too rich for him, and I'd love to get him in round 3. Now I'm not even sure he makes it to pick 45. I thought he had that great of a weekend, and you go back and watch his tape. I mean, he has great tape to back it up too. So you pair his athleticism with the game film, he has all the makings of a top 50 selection. And then lastly, it's the loser, and it pains me to say this about him because I was really high on him. He was my edge 2 coming in, but Ja'Kai Polite might have had the worst weekend of any player in the entire 2019 draft class. The biggest red flag early on was the interviews. He seemed to flunk them. He didn't appreciate the way that teams were going about him, which I think wasn't any different than any other players get treated, as far as kind of picking at your game and seeing how you respond to that. And and how you react, and he didn't react well. And then to couple that with the fact that he showed up, he showed up at a good weight, but again, just like kind of like Draymond Jones, it wasn't good weight, and it obviously slowed him down. Now, he used a hamstring injury as kind of his excuse of his poor 40 time, but most people believe that was kind of just him trying to save face and not necessarily a legit thing. So that kind of just adds to it. So, yeah, he's a guy that now we're talking is probably not even going to go round 1. And who knows if he even goes round 2. I mean, the comparison was made to Tim Williams last year from Alabama, kind of sliding all the way to round 3 for similar, off-field issues. So Ja'Kai Polite might be this year's Tim Williams when that's concerned. So he was my biggest loser at edge.
Interesting. I don't see Ja'Kai Polite sliding that far. But yeah,
as far as out of round 1, you don't think that's
no to round 3.
Well, I do think that's a stretch. I think round 2 is more appropriate, but again, I don't know. We'll see what he does at his pro day.
We'll see. Yeah, basically, he didn't. There were a lot of questions. There were a lot of sort of rumors about people questioning his maturity, and at least we're not in the room on the interviews, but at least from the outside looking in, it does seem like maybe there's some smoke, where there's fire to sort of that sort of narrative surrounding him. So in terms of sort of quieting those rumors, if you want to call them that, I don't think he did a great job doing that. So you're right. I think he's got another opportunity to sort of bounce back and really sort of kill it at his pro day. If he doesn't, then I think a slide into round 2 is possible, if not probable. So we'll have to see about that.
Yeah.
Let's wrap things up talking about the combine before we get into our mailbag questions. By the last position of need at the cornerback position, Matt, you have some winners and losers for us?
Yeah, I didn't pay real close attention on Monday to this group, but I did notice, Isaiah Johnson was a guy that, again, kind of fits the mold of a Seattle/Atlanta cornerback. Was he like 6'3", 205, I think he weighed in at, and he ran a 4.4. I mean, that's got Pete Carroll and Dan Quinn in a tizzy right now, especially Seattle, because I think they have a much bigger need at the position than Atlanta. So I kind of joked on Twitter that, watch them pick Isaiah Johnson in round 1, which, again, I don't think he has the game tape for a round 1 prospect, but he certainly has the tools you can't teach. So, and couple that with his incredible combine, I think he's definitely, a big riser at the cornerback spot, and it's doubtful that he'll make it past round 2, if I had to take a guess. The losers, I put Byron Murphy down. Again, I think he did well in the drills from what I saw. I mean, I'm not sure, as far as the expectations go, he ran in the 4.5s, mid 4.5s, I believe. And, that's not great if you're going to try to live on the outside as an outside cornerback, which he came in with talks that he could be the cornerback 1 prospect. And with that time, I'm not sure he can hold on to that rank. So, I had to put him on the list. And then another one that I was kind of hoping would do well, but, still kind of fly under the radar was Blaise Brown's kind of a day 3 guy from Troy University. Had the requisite measurements that the Falcons will look for. He has the 32-inch arms and all that. And I went and watched him on the weekend, and I was pretty impressed with his tape. He plays a little bit more off coverage. I don't know, and maybe the speed is the reason why he ran in the 4.7s, which that's really bad for a corner. So maybe that's why he's more of a zone guy. But again, the Falcons run a lot of zone here in this defense. So again, I don't know. That might push him even way down, and maybe we're looking at round 6, round 7 now. But he was a guy that didn't help himself, and probably is, not in the Falcons' plans anymore because of that speed time. But I was struggling to find names, but he was one that I was curious about and didn't pass the test really.
I'll add some names to the list to round things out. I thought David Long in the drills looked really good, and looking at his testing numbers, he also tested pretty well. And he's a guy that doesn't quite have the arm length that the Falcons typically look for. They typically targeted guys with like 32-inch arms. I think they'll they'd be willing to lower the threshold to maybe 31.5 if they like the other aspects of a player. Long comes in a little bit shy of 31 inches, but I think at the same time, I think given sort of where the Falcons need at the cornerback position is, like I don't think they necessarily need one of those big outside corners they have traditionally targeted. I think they need more of a guy that can sort of handle the quote unquote point guards that they'll be facing this year, because I think Isaiah Oliver is basically their power forward, and I guess you could say Desmond Trufant's their shooting guard or whatever. But they don't really have a guy other than Casey who's going to be able to handle the speed, and I don't necessarily know if that's really where Casey's is going to be, because he's probably be wind up playing in the slot this year. So the fast guys that play on the outside, they need someone like that, and maybe a guy like David Long could be that guy. A loser is, I know some people might disagree with me when I say this name, but I'm going to say Greedy Williams. He ran a really fast 40 at the 4.37, but basically pulled out of the drills at a certain point. And I think, I can't recall the exact circumstances, but I remember at the time thinking it was very similar to the Ja'Kai Polite thing, where he just kind of like decided like, oh, I'm not doing this anymore after he messed up a couple of their drills and whatnot, because he had, I remember now. Yeah, he was dealing with cramps. And so he started cramping up in the middle of the drills. But I think with Greedy Williams, and the narrative around Greedy Williams has always been about like desire and maturity and toughness and finishing and whatnot. And so to basically kind of struggle your way through the drills like he did a little bit early on, he really had to redo a couple of drills a number of times because he wasn't taking the coaching. And then to basically cramp up in the middle of it, sort of fits the narrative, at least if you're down on Greedy Williams, kind of fits the narrative that people have sort of been criticizing him over the last couple of months. So the cornerback position is going to be an interesting one, because I don't know if there is a consensus number one corner. Like we've assumed it would be either Greedy Williams or Byron Murphy or DeAndre Baker. But I think really this is just going to be teams they're going to like who they're going to like, and they're going to draft those guys whenever they feel like drafting them. And, it's anybody's guess to the order, I think, of how the cornerback position is going to go this year.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think, John Ledger made a good point when he was talking about, he had an article kind of summarizing the press conferences on Thursday, I believe it was. He had watched Thomas Dimitroff's press conference, and he said that as far as cornerbacks go in this class, teams that don't necessarily have a high need for it and kind of just, have a need to supplement their depth chart there, this is the type of class for them as far as the middle round guys. And he threw out a couple names. He threw out, I believe, Mark Edwards from Kentucky, and he threw out the Oregon dude that I can't pronounce his name.
But Amadi.
Yeah, and he looked good in the drills, by the way. But so I think, like you said, there's not a noticeable number one guy. There's not the high-end talent that you're necessarily slam dunk that you're looking for. But I think if in the middle rounds you want a guy that, again, might take a year or two to develop into a starter, but, can be serviceable on special teams or can be, serviceable in dime packages, I think this is the draft class for you. And I think it, again, bodes well and is very favorable for what the Falcons' needs go. So, yeah, I'm getting more and more comfortable with the idea that maybe a round 3, round 4 cornerback is in the Falcons' cards.
All right. We got a couple more minutes to get into some of these mailbag questions. The first one comes from Mave2124 on Twitter. Yes, despite all the names about to be cut in the next few days, can you explain why fans should expect the team to be on the sidelines and not sign any of these names? Thanks.
Well, I think if I'm interpreting this question correctly, I think it's just a simple answer as far as they don't have the money for it right now. I mean, we kind of talked about how the Grady Jarrett tag kind of took half of what they had in my calculations as far as rounding out their opening day roster, which is a little bit different than what their cap space is, just to clear that up. And I know Aaron likes to point that out
yes, I do.
Quite a bit to me. the way I look at it is just all the money in general for them to round out a 53-man roster, which the top 51 rule, which comes into play at the start of free agency up until week 1. You only take into account the top 51 contracts. But I'm basically looking at it, how is the Falcons going to round out their 53-man roster? Because once week 1 rolls around, all 53 contracts count. So how I've looked at it, before the Grady Jarrett tag, they had $30 million to fill out 15 spots on their roster. Now they have $15 million. Now, again, the hope is they're going to make Ryan Schrader a June 1 cut. That'll save a little over $6 million. That a big chunk of that will go to the draft fund, which is a little over $8 million projected right now for the year 1 cap hits for the 19 draft class. So again, you're not talking about big signings now at this point. You're talking more mid-tiers. You're talking more of the Fusco level contracts, bringing back a couple in-house guys like Bruce Irvin to modest contracts. Those are the types of deals right now that fans should expect, unless they make some more drastic roster cuts or somehow miraculously get some of these deals done ahead of schedule.
Yeah, and to clarify, if Schrader is a post June 1 cut, people should know that the Falcons don't get that cap space until June.
Right.
So basically, if they cut Schrader as a post June 1 cut, that's not going to help them spend money in March for free agents. So, basically to piggyback off of Matt, he's right. Their cap space, I think right now is around $7 million, but as he mentions, because of certain rules with only the top 51 players counting towards the cap, they have a little bit more room to spend than that. You could probably tack on another $3 to $5 million at a minimum to sort of spend on top of that $7 million in cap space. But basically, the way I sort of look at it is, give or take a couple of spots. I think the Falcons have maybe about 10 or 12 roster spots open right now. And with 9 draft picks, that basically means, only a handful of spots that they really, quote unquote, need to fill in free agency. I know people have differing opinions on what the Falcons' needs are, but I think that's basically the reason. And so, they're not going to necessarily go out there and spend all this money on some of these named players for the most part to fill sort of depth spots, because I think really outside the offensive line and of course the pass rush, there aren't really any needs for starters right now. Those are some, particularly on the defensive line, any named players really there are going to be pretty pricey. So, I think people should probably have pretty low expectations that the Falcons might get sort of a mid-level signing, someone like a Jack Crawford, like they did a couple of years ago. To me, that's probably going to be like sort of the biggest type of splash that they wind up doing this offseason in free agency. And then a whole bunch of sort of mid-tier guys. And you're right, Bruce Irvin might be basically like the equivalent of sort of their Jack Crawford type of deal to bring him back. So other than that, I just think people should, they're going to see, as the questioner asked, they're going to see a bunch of names like Justin Houston and various other people get cut, and they're going to be like, why can't we have that? And, as Matt and I have discussed previously, blame it on Vic Beasley. If that makes you feel better, that's basically what it is going to be about. So, I don't envy Vic Beasley because he's going to have a lot more resentment directed at him over the next couple of months. So a lot of expectations going on Vic Beasley this year. So I certainly don't envy that.
Yeah, I mean, I would make an additional comment, but there's enough pressure on him as it is. Let's just leave it at that.
Yeah. So our final question of the night is from Mark Saber at Mark's Remark. He asks, when did you guys get into the NFL draft? I watched it occasionally for a long time, but didn't get seriously into it until 2003. I would use every available moment in school that I had on computer access to study prospects.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a lifelong football fan, so I've watched it, but to say that I've watched it as intently as I do now, probably, it's only been really since the 2017 draft is when I've started to really take a focus on it, start studying prospects and all of that. I mean, back before that point, I was just kind of looking at it from a fan's eye view, kind of, yeah, who do the Falcons take this year? Do they make any splashes? I'll never forget. I remember it was the Julio Jones draft, 2011. Back when I think that was Thursday night still, the first
Then he
night.
started the
When did
Thursday night thing in 2010.
Yeah. So I remember, I was in college back then, and I think I had to write some sort of paper. So I was just in the computer lab, and there was TVs on. So I wasn't intently watching, but when I saw, I think I got an alert or something on my phone when I saw that Falcons were making the trade up. I was like, all right, the paper can wait. I got to see what's going on here. But other than that, it's not until, honestly, recently until 2017 where I'm really taking a major focus in this and kind of, studying prospects and seeing the fits and all that and kind of seeing how I do as far as, evaluators concerned. But yeah, I mean, I've always enjoyed it. It's always been a spectacle for me. And that's only increased, like I said, since 2017.
Yeah, my first memories of the draft are from the early 90s when I was like 7, 8 years old. Like I can remember Russell Maryland being the first overall pick in 1992. But like I slowly, steadily over the course of the 90s, I got into the draft. But probably the first time I really got into it was like in the 2000. That was like the first year I think I probably did like a mock draft where I knew enough to basically be able to at least make an attempt at predicting the draft. And I was like, I think at the time that was not working because I was volunteering, I should say, volunteering at a website called NFL Fans to do some draft stuff then. And then in 2001, I did my first draft preview where I did scouting reports. That was the Michael Vick draft. And you can actually go on falcons.com and find those old scouting reports. And I should use air quotes when I say scouting reports, because basically I just watched the bowl games that year and like wrote a paragraph on what I thought of some of the top prospects then. And, I like to believe I've come a long way from those old scouting reports, but you can go find them on falcons.com in the off-season tab under Draft Central. But yeah, slowly and steadily since then, I've gotten more and more into the draft to the point where it sort of peaked in that 2011 draft, where I remember doing like 300 scouting reports. I watched so much film that year, watching guys at college throughout the fall. And then the Falcons traded up for Julio Jones. I did 300 scouting reports. They wound up taking like 4 out of the 300 I drafted. And so ever since then, I've just basically like, I'm not going to put in that much time and energy and effort to sort of reap almost no reward for it. And so basically now, since then, I've basically sort of been like, I'll do a little bit of preliminary stuff. I want to have some familiarity and some idea of sort of most of the top, 50 to 100 prospects in the draft and at some key areas of need. I'll sort of watch a couple of games for some guys that are going to be some day 3 guys. But for the most part, I'll just wait till after the Falcons draft their players, and then that's when I'll do my sort of deep dives on the film and whatnot. So, yeah, that started after that 2011 draft where it just, it's a lot of work. So when you see like even the Mel Kipers of the world or the John Ledgers of the world that Matt mentioned, all these guys that do all these scouting reports, like I have experienced that once in my life, and basically my thought process was never again. Yeah, it's a lot of work that goes into doing all that stuff. So, give some respect out there for all the draftniks and the draft gurus out there. Even if you disagree with their opinion, they work really hard to do the stuff that they do. And so show some love, show some appreciation for all those people out there.
Absolutely.
All right, guys, there it is for tonight's episode. We apologize for, not going live on YouTube and Facebook as we usually do and using the Pro Football Central Periscope page. But maybe this will be a new sort of wrinkle that we'll add to the lineup, and maybe we'll be able to do, I don't know, a triple broadcast or something in the future and whatnot. But as usual, we'll do our hour-long shows. And if you want to submit your questions for future mailbags and for next week's episode, where we'll be basically talking all free agency all night long in the middle of the tampering period as the Falcons do absolutely nothing. And everybody is upset about it. But use the hashtag Falcons Mailbag on Twitter. Send them over to the show's Twitter handle at Falcons PFC. Of course, check out Pro Football Central on Twitter at PF Central, so you don't miss a show, as well as at the YouTube page of Pro Football Central. Make sure you hit that bell icon when you subscribe so that you know when we go live. And of course, check us out on Facebook at Falcons Central Radio. Matt, anything you want to plug before we duck out of here?
No, I don't really have much going on. Hopefully, I'll be back shortly before the draft. I want to do another mock draft piece. Maybe we'll do kind of a group effort one at riseupreader.com. So maybe keep a lookout for that. But no, we'll see you next week to preview the free agency period.